but I think we're understanding better what is holding Africa back. And I think as we understand this better, then there's scope for the actions that are required to follow.
Welcome to another IATP Explainer. This week we are joined by David Luke. David Luke is a professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He focuses on African trade policy and trade negotiations. He has extensive experience in policy advisory services and has previously completed assignments for the African Union, the United Nations Development Program, and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Why is increased trade an important part of Africa's economic future?
History shows that countries only developed and prospered through trade, through production and trade. You can go back to the earliest manifestations of human activity on this planet, where if I'm a hunter, I go out and kill game and I bring it back. And if you're a farmer, you produce grain and I exchange my meat and you give me grain and so on. So even in the most simplest societies as they've evolved, have had some kind of production and exchange. And when you have production and exchange, the parties are better off and increase in terms of their prosperity, or even, if you like, their utility and so on. So this is just a fact of the way that societies have evolved historically. Fast forward to 21st century Africa, the story is no different for Africa. Trade is what would transform African economies as traders transformed economies everywhere throughout human history. And even the data that we have makes that very clear. If you look at all the sources of revenue that flows into Africa, you see that trade is by far the largest source of revenue into Africa. So the message is very clear. The future of Africa depends on trade, as it does for every other country. So I'm not saying anything that is that does not apply elsewhere. This is just a universal application. That also applies to Africa.
Can you tell us a little bit about a new book that you just edited called How Africa Trades? Who is this book written for, and how can the information in it be best utilized?
I was delighted to work on this book. It's the first project that we have worked on since we established the Africa Trade Policy Program at the Fiyoz Institute for Africa at the London School of Economics and Political Science. How Africa Trades came about because we wanted to give an overview of African trade and to do it in a way that is non-technical, that will be easy to follow by anyone who is interested in the subject, and to ensure that we cover the most important aspects of African trade today. So we broke this down into several parts that we wanted to look at. We wanted to look at what it is in the first place that Africa trades, what are the products, what are the services, and so on. Where does African trade stand in relation to global trade, and what emerges when we look at African trade in the global picture? We wanted to look at that. We wanted to look at who Africa trades with, who are the trading partners, what are their shares, what are the characteristics and the agreements or concessions that underlie the trade flows between Africa and these partners, what insights we could get from this, not just to describe what's happening, but to analyze all of this from the perspective of Africa's development, since our starting point was that trade contributes to transforming economies to prosperity. So we wanted to understand if this trade is contributing to Africa's prosperity or not, or what is the story there? We also wanted to understand how trade is carried out on the African continent itself, between African countries. What's the extent of this trade? What are its characteristics? What is its future? What role would the African Continental Free Trade Area, this big trade deal that has been agreed by the African countries, what it implies for Africa and so on. So we wanted to look at all of those things as well. Since we were coming out of the pandemic, we wanted to understand what happened to Africa's trade during the pandemic, both formal trade and informal trade. We wanted to understand whether digitalization is affecting African trade and in what ways, especially since with the pandemic and lockdowns, digitalization took off in a much faster way than one would have imagined in many countries. So we wanted to look at that aspect as well. And then finally, we wanted to make the case for how African trade could better serve Africa's development. And so the book in its concluding chapter looks at that and says what needs to be done by Africa's partners, what needs to be done by Africans themselves, their own institutions, their own policies and their leadership and so on. So we have messages for Africa's partners, Africa's leaders, policymakers, and also for stakeholders. So that's how the book came about and what it is that we wanted to achieve in the book. Now, who is the book for? As I said, we deliberately were non-technical. We tried to break everything down in a way that it could be easily understood. So the book is for anyone who is interested in Africa's trade, in Africa's development, in Africa's prosperity. We think that there are many insights there that could be used by anyone really interested in these sorts of issues. And that's why the book is available free of charge. It's published on an open access basis so that the data, the analysis, and so on could be used as people see best how they could use them. So basically, that's what the book is about, how it came about, and who it is for.
How can the rest of the world best support the African Continental Free Trade Area?
The African Continental Free Trade Area is an effort to bring down the trade barriers between African countries, to open up trade on the African continent so that the African countries could grow their trade with one another. This is important because of the way that the African countries have been inserted into the global economy. And that happened through the colonial relations of the past, where the trade was mainly with the colonial relation, mainly structured. I should put it very carefully here. The trade in the past was mainly structured in relation to the colonial arrangements that were there at the time. So if you were a British colony, the trade was mainly with the UK. If you're a French colony, the trade was mainly with France, not with the African, or not between the African countries. Over time, what we have seen, and since independence, it has been this pattern of trading with the colonial powers has stubbornly resisted change. And I think everyone has grown comfortable with it, including even the African elites, because that is what they knew. It worked, even though one could say that the benefits were much less than if they were trading among themselves and trading the rest of the world much more openly and so on. But that's what they knew, and everyone was comfortable with this. But nonetheless, through the African Union and all the discussions that they have as to how they can improve their trade, they did come to a realization that the trade could be improved, it could be made better, especially if African countries are trading among themselves. They also could see the data that was emerging, that when Africa traded among itself, they tended to trade more value-added products. But when they traded with the rest of the world, they tended to trade only commodities. I think it's about 80% of Africa's trade with the rest of the world is just commodities, whilst when they traded among themselves, that number falls down to only to about 40%, because about 60% of intra-African trade is value-added trade. Then on top of that, whilst in terms of value, the trade between the African countries is small. It's only about 15% of Africa's overall trade. There was clearly the potential for that trade to grow, and that's the kind of trade you wanted to grow anyway, because it's more value-added trade. But at the same time, they could see that there are trade barriers between them. The infrastructure not very good, problems with customs, the thickness of borders, as we say, and so on. So they thought that they should have a trade deal where they would bring all the tariffs between African countries down to zero over a period of about 15 years. They would also open the markets to trade in services between the countries, so not just goods. And then on top of that, they also thought that they could have some common rules in important areas like investment. It touches on trade, of course, intellectual property, competition policy, and so on. So they were not trying to create something like a European Union with supranational national institutions, but what they wanted to do was just simply open up the trade, and that's why it's just a free trade area. Similar to what North America has, by the way, in the form of the NAFTA, which is now, I believe, the UMSCA, which is just a free trade area deal between Canada, the US, and Mexico. So something like that. They wanted to create a whole continent-wide market, which, of course, would make investment more attractive, could make for greater scalability of goods and services being produced, would stir up production, which could also generate the kinds of jobs that the African youth, given the population of Africa and how fast it's growing, etc. So it all made sense for the African countries to come together to say that they want to create this continental market. So that's the thinking behind the AFC FTA. I think it's remarkable that they have come this far with it, considering that the deal was signed in 2018. And 5 years later, it is taking baby steps, admittedly only baby steps, towards implementation. But I am myself, really amazed at how the rest of the world has come to realize that this is an important deal for Africa. So I'm seeing the World Bank, the IMF, of course, the UN agencies, the development partners, all supporting this deal. But at the same time, there are some risks that we are seeing, and which are pointed out in the book. And one of these risks is that the old trade arrangements between African countries, mainly the former colonial partners, tend to still undermine what the African countries are trying to do through the African Continental Free Trade area. The EU is the best example of this, which has its own trade deals with different groups of African countries. Now, these deals that the EU has undermines the kind of integration that the African countries need to achieve, really to make trade among themselves work smoothly. And so we criticize that in the book when we look at the trade between the European Union and the African countries. We also made the same criticism when we looked at the trade arrangements between the African countries and the UK, which of course left the European Union, has its own trade policy, but then copied what the European Union had been doing. Then we also looked at other partners. We looked at the US, and we thought that the US model, through what is known as the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, that does not require reciprocal access of the US into the African market. So the US, unlike the EU, is not making deals which undermine the institutional framework for integrating the African economies on trade and so on. So we thought that the US model was better. We didn't say that it's perfect, because we also said that the US model could be improved, and we show ways in which it could be improved in the book. But we thought that the US model is better. And we thought that this was somewhat ironical, because the Americans tend to take a lot of flack for many things around the world. But this is something that they're doing well, and they're not being given credit for. So we thought that that was a bit ironical, especially when you compare that also with China. China has no meaningful trade policy with the African countries, trade arrangements that are anything like what the US has offered, or what the EU and the UK and others do. So we thought that for this AFC FTA to be successful, countries need to move towards the kind of model that the US has. And I think we sounded a note of anxiety in the book that we hope that the US would keep that model, because we think that that is an important model, especially at this current stage of Africa's development. That is the kind of model that you want to see. So yes, so we thought that that's the model that could support what the AFC FTA is trying to achieve.
When will trading start under the AFC FTA, and what industries will benefit most when trade gets flowing?
As I said, the deal was signed in 2018, and as I said, it's really impressive how far they've come along since then. The secretariat that would administer this deal is in place. The negotiations to finalize the deal, nearly all of it is done. Especially on services, they've been able to identify the priority sectors that they would open up for liberalization to begin with, and then over time, the others that would follow. And commitments have been made on these services sectors. By the way, they include financial services, communications services, transport services, tourism, and business services. And you can see that these are the core services that can support trade as well. So a lot has been done on that front. Where they were stuck is on trading goods, and especially the rules of origin, where in a free trade area, you want to make sure that all the goods that are produced in the free trade area actually originate from the free trade area, so that then the zero tariffs that they're moving towards could apply all across the free trade area market. Now, they were stuck because there are two very sensitive sectors that all the countries are interested in, and they wanted to make sure that no country gets a benefit in those sectors that the others don't have. So the two sectors were textiles and clothing, and automotive sector. Textiles and clothing, it's self-evident that firstly, it's an industry that's relatively easy to get into, and all the countries are interested in it. And they just wanted to make sure that the goods produced, clothes, other forms of textiles that are produced actually originate from Africa. Or if there are inputs that are coming from elsewhere, it is clear and transparent what threshold will be allowed for those inputs that are coming from outside of the continent. And it's not been easy to negotiate and get agreement on that. The same with the automotive sector. Most of the countries understand that the automotive sector is a very powerful sector that can drive the industrialization process with many spin-offs, many other advantages, and so on. So they're all very keen to make sure, again, that the rules on the different inputs that are needed and so on are clear and transparent. They understood, of course, that they will need inputs from outside of the continent, but they wanted to make sure that they're all on the same page, that they're very clear on what they're allowing and the threshold that they're allowing, and so on. Now, I understand that the negotiations in these two areas are now nearly done. There's an expectation that during the course of this year, those negotiations will be finalized. And if those negotiations are finalized, the deal could formally begin to operate as it is, expected it would. So that's what's holding up the full, if you like, operationalization of the deal. So when will trading start? Trading will start when this technical aspect is concluded. But in the meantime, a group of countries said, well, rather than wait until all of this is done, let us start trading anyway, and applying all the rules that we have agreed on so far. So you have, I think, 8 countries that are in this scheme where they've started trading among themselves on the rules that have been agreed so far. And I think that just also illustrates the urgency that a number of these countries see, the opportunities that they see in this trade deal. Now, which industries will benefit? I would say all industries will benefit, whether you're looking at the agricultural sector, of course, which dominates the African production landscape. Suddenly bringing tariffs down to 0 makes it cheaper for goods to be sent across borders because they don't have to pay any duty when goods travel across borders. Industrial sectors, manufacturing sectors would benefit because it's a bigger market. The African population now is 1.2 billion, and within that, about 300 million is estimated to be middle class, meaning that they have the kind of purchasing power that you find, wherever the middle class is. So it's quite a large market. The middle class is about the same size as the market in Europe or the US. So it's quite a large market. So all industries will benefit. Services also would benefit. And especially when you have so many diverse countries on the African continent, 54 countries. The expectation is not that they would all be producing the same things, doing the same things, and so on. But in fact, you'd have regional value chains where some countries would be producing inputs that are used in other countries because trade can flow more smoothly, supply chains can flow more smoothly, and so on. So I think all sectors, all industries would benefit. Investors also would see the African market as much more attractive since it's not just investing in one country, and the African countries tend to be small because of the way Africa was carved up into all these many different states. So there's that opportunity then for scalability, deriving these scale economies and so on from this market. So this is a deal that is potentially win-win for all of the African countries, and I would say also for the rest of the world, because a prosperous Africa would also be a stable Africa. A stable Africa means less pressure on migration, instability, political conflict, and so on. Many of those things you can trace back to poverty, lack of opportunities, and so on. So I think with all industries, all sectors benefiting, overall the picture for Africa would be much better than it has been, and as that we have seen in the past.
What makes you optimistic about Africa's future?
It's. I think one has to be optimistic because the human agency is always one that is seeking to improve things as they are. I think that's what humans everywhere aspire towards. They want to improve things as they are. And I think that also applies in the African context. It's not going to be easy. No one is suggesting that. But I think we're understanding better what is holding Africa back. And I think as we understand this better, then there's scope for the actions that are required to follow. So from that point of view, this is not naive optimism. I think as we understand the constraints, the opportunities, I think you'll find the responses that could, if you like, change the game. So I do hope that our book contributes to that. Certainly, that's why we wrote it. That's why we worked on it. And I think there's a lot there that shows that yes, much of what we are saying could happen. So I'm optimistic on that point. Not, as I said, it's not naive optimism, but a better understanding of what needs to be done.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this video, you may find some of our other work interesting. Check out another video here. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button below, leave a comment, and follow the IATP on Twitter at @the_IATP.